Welcome to Life Stories, where we share real-life experiences and the lessons that come with them. Today, we dive into a story about boundaries, family, and the struggle for independence. It's a tale of a young couple trying to build a life together in their new home, only to be faced with overbearing parents who just can't let go. What happens when the line between caring and controlling is crossed? Join us as we explore the journey of reclaiming your space, your life, and your peace. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to begin today's story. When Ethan and I finally moved into our new home in Austin, Texas, I couldn't help but feel a wave of excitement wash over me. We had been married for just under a year, and this house, this small but cozy 3-bedroom in a quiet neighborhood, was supposed to be the fresh start we had dreamed of. I could already imagine the years ahead, filling it with memories, laughter, and maybe even the pitter-patter of little feet one day. But little did I know, the dream we envisioned would soon be overshadowed by the very people we had hoped would give us space to grow: Ethan's parents. John and Carol, Ethan's parents, were always much. They were the kind of people who couldn't help but impose themselves on every situation, no matter how small. In the beginning, I thought their overbearing nature would fade once we had our own place. After all, we had been dating for a while before we got married, and their constant phone calls and unsolicited advice seemed like minor annoyances. His mother would call him 5 times a day, reminding him about his vitamins. His father would make sure to check in with us every time we went out for a date night. Yes, it was irritating, but I naively thought that once we had our own home, they would gradually back off, allowing us to build our life together. I was wrong. We had barely been in the house for a day when they showed up. No warning, no invitation, just their car pulling into the driveway as if they had the right to be there. I was still unpacking when I heard the knock at the door. I hesitated, hoping it wasn't them, but when I opened it, there they were, John and Carol, grinning from ear to ear. I put on my best smile, though inside, I was already irritated. "Hi there, honey," Carol said, stepping into the house without waiting for me to invite her in. She took in the place with the kind of critical eye I had seen too many times before, as though she were inspecting a hotel room that didn't meet her standards. "We brought you a little housewarming gift," she added, shoving a bottle of cheap wine into my hands. John followed closely behind her, holding a printed-out list of home maintenance tips, as if we were incapable of taking care of our own space. I felt the heat rise in my chest, but I kept my composure. I smiled, trying to remain polite, even as they continued to parade around our house, looking for flaws they could point out. But the real shock came when Carol, settling herself onto the couch like she owned the place, casually asked, "So, when do we get our spare key?" I blinked, unsure if I had heard her right. "I'm sorry, what?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. John, chuckling at my confusion, answered before I could even process the question. "Oh sweetheart, come on, of course. We need a key, you know, just in case." "In case of what?" I asked, now thoroughly baffled. Carol chimed in before I could stop her. "You know, in case of an emergency, or if we need to check in on things. Water the plants. Make sure you're keeping up with the cleaning." I stood there in stunned silence, my mind racing. Was she serious? Was I hearing this correctly? They wanted a key to our home so they could come and go as they pleased? I turned to Ethan, hoping he would shut this nonsense down. But instead, he nodded in agreement. "Yeah, that makes sense," he said, completely oblivious to how outrageous the request was. And then, without hesitation, he handed them a copy of our house key. Every ounce of anger I felt surged within me, but I forced myself to smile. "Oh, of course," I said, my voice tight with restraint. "You're absolutely right. It took everything in me not to scream. How could he let them walk all over us like this?" But I knew I had to play it cool, at least for now, so I smiled and acted as agreeable as I could, even suggesting they stop by whenever they wanted. But inside, I was boiling. This wasn't just a matter of boundaries, it was about control. and I wasn't going to let them control our lives any longer. As I silently stewed, I started planning. I knew I couldn't confront them directly just yet. Instead, I decided to play the long game. For the next week, I acted like the perfect daughter-in-law, sweet, understanding, and accommodating. Even Carol stopped raising an eyebrow at my behavior. They thought I had caved. That they had won. But what they didn't know was that every free moment I had, I was setting up a trap. A trap that would show them just how far they were willing to go. And what would happen when they crossed the line. The next week, everything was ready. I had done my part. And now, it was time to see if they would take the bait. But as much as I was prepared for it, nothing could have prepared me for how satisfying it would feel when they walked right into it. A week passed. Ethan and I had settled into our routine. And I had kept up the facade. I was polite, I was accommodating, and I made sure to show just enough appreciation for their help. But deep down, I was preparing for the inevitable, when they would try to step over the line again. I knew they wouldn't stop at just a spare key. They had already shown us how little they respected our privacy. So I couldn't trust them not to push further. Every night, after Ethan went to bed, I worked in silence. I installed a second lock on the inside of the front door. One of those heavy-duty hotel-style locks that could only be opened from the inside. It wasn't the kind of thing that screamed obvious to anyone unfamiliar with the house. But it was the kind of lock that could keep someone out when they didn't belong. Next, I set up a motion-activated camera in the living room. It wasn't overly conspicuous, just tucked away in the corner where it could capture any movement that might happen in the house. The camera sent real-time alerts straight to my phone. I wanted to know, immediately, when they showed up. Finally, I made a phone call to my Uncle Jack. He wasn't exactly a regular visitor in our lives. But he was someone I trusted completely. He was large, intimidating, and had a presence that made anyone rethink their approach. He had his own home but was more than willing to help me out with this little experiment. The plan was simple. While I laid the groundwork, he would be in the house. Just in case things went sideways. I didn't expect it to go as far as I was planning. But I needed to be prepared. Everything was set, and now, I just had to wait. It didn't take long for them to make their move. It was exactly 1 week later when my phone buzzed at 10:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. I glanced at the alert. It was from the security camera. Motion detected in the living room. My heart raced in anticipation. I opened the app on my phone, my fingers shaking with both anxiety and excitement. There they were, John and Carol, in my house. But they weren't just standing there. They were snooping. I watched as John opened the kitchen cabinets and drawers, rummaging through them like he was searching for something. I could feel the anger rising inside me. The nerve. Carol was in the living room, smoothing out the throw blanket on the couch, then making her way toward the bedroom. And then, something happened that made my blood run cold. Carol started folding my laundry. My laundry. They thought they had the right to walk in whenever they wanted. Go through my personal belongings. Clean up after me like I was some irresponsible child. I couldn't believe it. I stared at the screen in disbelief and anger. This wasn't just a violation of privacy. It was a blatant attempt to control my space. And then, just as I had planned, they tried to leave, but they were locked inside. I watched as John turned the doorknob to the front door, only to find it wouldn't open. He yanked it harder. Still nothing. Carol came over, confused. He rattled the knob again, this time with more force. But it still wouldn't budge. And that's when they saw it, the second lock. High up on the door, hidden from view. John froze. His face turned an alarming shade of red, and his eyes narrowed as he stared at the lock. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, his voice a low growl. Before he could even process what was happening, the door to the basement opened with a creak. I felt a chill run down my spine as I saw Uncle Jack step into the living room. Cracking his knuckles, he was every bit the imposing figure I needed him to be. Well, he said, his voice gravelly. "What do we have here?" John's eyes went wide, and Carol's mouth fell open. What the hell are you doing in our house? John snapped, his face twisted with rage. Uncle Jack raised an eyebrow and glanced at them coolly. Your house? He repeated, his tone almost amused. Funny, I don't remember you living here. John's face shifted from anger to confusion, and Carol seemed to shrink under Uncle Jack's stare. Uncle Jack pulled a set of keys from his pocket and held them up, dangling them in front of them like a trophy. That's right, he said, a smirk tugging at his lips. I live here, and here's the lease agreement to prove it. I felt a surge of satisfaction as he pulled out a piece of paper. Unfolding it slowly, it was a signed lease agreement, dated and notarized, proving that Uncle Jack had sublet the house from us for a week, legally. John and Carol stared at the document, their faces draining of color. They were caught. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I had the upper hand. I wasn't just defending our home, I was taking control of the situation in a way they would never expect. The power was in my hands now, and I wasn't about to let them forget it. The tension in the room was thick, almost suffocating, as John and Carol stood there, processing what had just happened. Uncle Jack was still leaning casually against the wall, completely unfazed by the chaos he had just dropped into the middle of our lives. His calm presence was the only thing keeping me grounded as I watched the wheels turn in John's head. I knew he wasn't going to take this lightly. I could see it in the way his fists clenched and his jaw tightened, the anger simmering just beneath the surface. Carol, on the other hand, looked more confused than anything else. Her eyes darted between Uncle Jack, the lease agreement, and me, trying to make sense of the situation. But there was no going back. They had crossed a line that could never be erased, and I wasn't about to let them pretend it didn't happen. John finally broke the silence. His voice was low and dangerous as he looked Uncle Jack in the eye. You're lying, he spat, his fingers twitching with the desire to lash out. Uncle Jack's smirk never faltered. Am I? He asked. Not even remotely intimidated. You can call it whatever you want. But the facts are right there in black and white. I watched as John snatched the lease agreement from Jack's hands, his fingers trembling with fury as he scanned the document. Carol was still standing there, wide-eyed, as if she had just woken up to a nightmare she couldn't understand. This is crap, John muttered, his voice thick with disbelief. There's no way you're legally allowed to do this. Uncle Jack chuckled, his deep voice almost mocking. You'll have to take that up with the landlord. He didn't seem to have a problem with it. Carol's hands were shaking now, her lips trembling as she whispered, "This is ridiculous." I could feel my own anger bubbling up inside me again. But I held it back. This wasn't about winning a shouting match. It was about making them understand the gravity of what they had done. I leaned forward, my voice steady but full of conviction. "What's ridiculous," I said, "is that you thought you had the right to just walk into our home whenever you wanted. To treat us like we're children who need supervision. To invade our space like you own it." For the first time in the conversation, John looked uncomfortable. He shifted his weight, glancing at Carol, who still hadn't said much. But I could see her eyes flicker with guilt, though she refused to admit it. That's when I made the decision. I wasn't going to let them walk away from this unscathed, thinking they could try again. I wasn't going to let them repeat this behavior in the future. This was a turning point. Before they could speak, I stood up, walking toward the door. I needed space. I needed to think. "I'm done with this," I said firmly. "If you ever do something like this again, I will make sure you regret it. You will not get away with treating us this way." John's face darkened. He stepped forward, his fists clenched. "You're making a huge mistake. You know that?" he said, his voice full of venom. I didn't flinch. I stood my ground, my heart racing but my mind clear. "No, John, you're the one making the mistake. You think you can control us. But you're wrong. This is our life, and you're not going to ruin it." Uncle Jack's laugh broke the tension. A low, throaty sound. "I'm afraid she's right," he said, his eyes narrowing on John. "You're not welcome here anymore. Not now. Not ever." The weight of those words hung in the air, heavy and final. John's nostrils flared as he stepped back, his eyes dark with rage. Carol, still frozen in shock, slowly turned to face him. But she didn't speak. Her eyes were downcast, and I could see the realization beginning to hit her. They had pushed us too far. Without another word, I walked to the door. I needed to put an end to this. Once and for all. Get out, I said, my voice cold. You're not welcome here. Not anymore. They didn't argue. They didn't say another word. John grabbed Carol's arm, and they left, slamming the door behind them as they walked out of our house. The moment they were gone, the silence was deafening. I stood there for a moment, breathing deeply, trying to calm my racing heart. This wasn't how I imagined things would go. But it was necessary. It had to be done. Uncle Jack left soon after, his presence still hanging in the air like a shield. He didn't say much, just a quiet nod as he left, leaving me alone to process everything. I stood in the middle of the living room, staring at the empty space around me, and I realized something. This wasn't just about setting boundaries. It was about standing up for what we had, for the life we were building. And in that moment, I knew I had done the right thing. But as the days went by, the consequences of our actions started to settle in, and I realized just how far John and Carol would go to keep their hold on us. What I didn't expect was the next move they would make, a move that would test every ounce of patience and resolve I had left. In the days that followed, it felt like everything had shifted. I could sense the distance between Ethan and his parents growing wider. And while that saddened me for him, I knew it was necessary. The guilt he carried in his heart slowly started to fade. And with it, the weight of his parents' control. We changed the locks. And though we hadn't heard from John and Carol since the confrontation, I knew they hadn't forgotten. They were still out there, plotting their next move. But nothing could prepare me for the phone call that came a few days later. Our landlord called with a tone that immediately set off alarm bells. He told me that John and Carol had reached out to him, asking if he would consider terminating our lease early. They offered to pay off the remaining months if he would agree to lease the house to them instead. My stomach churned. They had gone that far, trying to force us out of our own home. The final straw came when I decided to confront them one last time. I went to their house, calm and collected, and when Carol opened the door, I could see the apprehension in her eyes. John wasn't far behind, and he was no less angry than before. But this time, I wasn't afraid. This time, I was done. I told them, in no uncertain terms, that they had crossed the line one too many times, that their actions had pushed us to a breaking point, and there would be no turning back. No more games, no more control. It wasn't just about defending our home anymore. It was about reclaiming our lives, our peace, and our freedom. And that was the moment they finally understood, at least. I hoped they did. If you want to hear more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for new life stories and real life experiences.